Hey everyone, welcome to Turning Points. I'm Rowan, and with me as always is my incredibly curious co host, Alex.
Hi, everyone. I'm already intrigued by today's topic, Rowan. You mentioned something earlier about a single meeting that changed everything.
That's right. What if I told you that one meeting between two diplomats back in 1916 set off a chain of events that would reshape the entire Middle East for the next century?
Wait, one meeting did all that? That seems almost impossible.
Yet here we are looking at the consequences 100 years later. Today we're diving into what we're calling the ripple effect, how Western interventions in the Middle East created waves that are still crashing on shores across the region.
And we're talking about some pretty significant numbers here, right? I mean, in terms of both human impact and financial cost?
Absolutely. We're looking at costs running into trillions of dollars, over 1 million civilian casualties since 1990 alone, and about 12 million refugees and displaced persons.
Those numbers they're just staggering.
They are, and today we'll trace this journey from those first colonial era decisions right through to modern drone warfare, exploring how Western powers have fundamentally reshaped the Middle East's political, social, and cultural landscape.
I can tell this is going to be quite the journey.
Let me take you back to 1916. Picture this. Two men, Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot, sitting in a room with nothing but a map and some colored pencils, literally drawing lines that would reshape millions of lives.
Wait, they just drew lines on a map, just like that?
Just like that, Sykes famously declared he wanted to draw a line from the E in Aker to the last K in Kirkuk. It sounds almost comically simple, but the consequences were anything but funny.
That's incredibly arbitrary. Did they consider the people actually living in these regions?
That's the thing. They really didn't. These two diplomats representing Britain and France essentially carved up the Ottoman Empire's Arab provinces without any real consideration for ethnic groups, tribal territories, or historical connections.
So what exactly did this agreement do?
The Sykes-Picot Agreement effectively divided the Middle East into British and French spheres of influence. Britain would control what became Iraq and Jordan, while France got Syria and Lebanon. But here's where it gets really interesting. This was all done in complete secrecy.
How did people find out about it?
Now that's a fascinating twist. The Bolsheviks found the agreement in the Russian diplomatic archives after the Russian Revolution and published it. They basically exposed this secret deal to the world.
Oh, wow. I can imagine that didn't go down well with the local populations.
That's putting it mildly. The Arab leaders who had helped Britain fight against the Ottoman Empire, they felt completely betrayed. Britain had promised them independence in exchange for their support during World War I.
So they were fighting for their freedom, but instead got new colonial rulers?
Exactly. And here's where we see the real long-term impact. These arbitrary borders created countries that lumped together different ethnic and religious groups who historically hadn't shared power. Take Iraq, for example.
Which groups are we talking about?
You had Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, and Kurds all suddenly expected to function as one nation. The Kurds especially got a raw deal. Their traditional homeland ended up split between 4 different countries.
That must have created some serious tensions.
Absolutely. And those tensions are still playing out today. The Kurdish independence movement, the sectarian conflicts in Iraq, the civil war in Syria. You can trace so many of these back to those lines drawn on a map in 1916.
It's kind of mind-boggling that two men with colored pencils could have such a massive impact on history.
And here's something that really shows the lasting impact. When ISIS emerged and started taking territory in 2014, one of their stated goals was to erase the Sykes-Picot borders. They actually used the slogan, "breaking the borders of Sykes-Picot."
So even a century later, these borders are still a major source of conflict?
Absolutely. Think about it. We're talking about borders that were drawn up in secret by colonial powers without any local input. They ignored centuries of cultural, religious, and ethnic realities on the ground. It's like trying to solve a puzzle by forcing pieces together that don't fit.
And I'm guessing you can't just redraw these borders now? Too much has happened since then?
That's right. These borders have become somewhat fixed in international law, even though they're often challenged on the ground. It's created this ongoing tension between the political reality of these nation states and the social reality of the communities living within them.
It really shows how decisions made in one moment can echo through generations.
And that's exactly what makes this such a perfect example of Western intervention in the Middle East. It set a precedent for outside powers making decisions about the region without considering local perspectives or consequences. Now, as we move into the Cold War era, those colonial-era interventions took on a whole new dimension. The Middle East became this intense chess game between the US and Soviet Union.
So we went from colonial powers drawing lines on maps to what exactly?
Well, let me take you to around 1953. Picture this. Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's democratically elected prime minister, has just nationalized the country's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British.
That seems like a pretty reasonable thing for a country to do with its own resources.
You'd think so, but the British weren't happy about losing their oil interests. And here's where it gets really interesting. They convinced the US that Mossadegh was somehow leading Iran toward communism.
Even though he wasn't actually communist?
Not at all. But that didn't matter in the Cold War mindset. The CIA and British intelligence launched Operation Ajax. And this is where we see how Western powers had evolved from drawing lines on maps to actually removing leaders they didn't like.
So, what exactly happened in Operation Ajax?
They orchestrated this incredibly complex coup. They paid protesters, spread propaganda, and eventually managed to overthrow Mossadegh. They replaced him with Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran.
And I'm guessing the Shah was more cooperative with Western interest?
Exactly. The Shah became this crucial US ally, but, and this is important, he was also incredibly repressive toward his own people. He used his secret police, the Savak, to crush any opposition.
That sounds like it might have had some serious consequences down the line.
Oh, it absolutely did. All that repression eventually led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The Shah was overthrown, and Iran became an Islamic republic that was deeply anti-Western, especially anti-American.
So the US basically created its own worst enemy?
In a way, yes. And here's the real kicker. This pattern repeated itself across the region. The US and Soviet Union would each back different sides in local conflicts, turning them into these huge proxy wars.
Like, what happened in Afghanistan?
Exactly. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the US started funding and arming the Mujahideen resistance fighters. But after the Soviets withdrew, these same weapons and training ended up being used by groups that would later turn against the West.
It's like every solution created new problems.
That's what happens when you treat complex local issues as simple Cold War chess pieces. And the consequences, they're still with us today. Iran and the US still have this deeply antagonistic relationship that can be traced directly back to 1953.
It really shows how these interventions created this cycle of unintended consequences.
And what's fascinating is how this changed the nature of power in the region. The Cold War transformed local political movements into these international battlegrounds. Suddenly, every domestic reform movement or push for independence got caught up in this global power struggle.
So even legitimate local movements for change got tainted by being associated with either the US or Soviet side.
Precisely. And that created this really toxic dynamic where local leaders either had to pick a side in the Cold War or risk being overthrown. It completely distorted the natural political development of these countries.
And I'm guessing that distortion didn't just disappear when the Cold War ended?
Not at all. These interventions fundamentally altered the political DNA of the region. They created these deep-seated suspicions about Western motives that still influence Middle Eastern politics today.
It's like each layer of intervention just made everything more complicated.
And created new justifications for future interventions. It's this cycle that keeps repeating, just in different form. You know, there's another crucial aspect of Western intervention that we need to talk about: the astronomical financial cost of modern military operations in the Middle East.
I imagine we're talking about some pretty big numbers here.
Big doesn't even begin to cover it. Let's start with Operation Desert Storm in 1991. That campaign alone cost $61 billion, and that was considered relatively modest by today's standards.
Modest? That sounds like an enormous amount of money.
Well, wait until you hear this. The Iraq War that began in 2003 has cost around $2 trillion. And the war in Afghanistan, that's reached about $2.3 trillion.
Hold on. Are you saying we're talking about over $4 trillion just for those two conflicts?
And that's just the direct military spending. The real costs are actually much higher when you factor in things like long-term veteran care, interest on war debt, and the economic impact on the region.
What kind of economic impact are we talking about?
Think about it. When you destroy infrastructure like power plants, roads, hospitals, that doesn't just affect military targets, it cripples entire economies. Iraq's GDP dropped by 41% in the first year of the war alone.
And I'm guessing someone has to pay to rebuild all of that?
Exactly. The U.S. has spent nearly $140 billion on reconstruction efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. But here's the thing, a lot of that money didn't actually achieve its intended purpose.
What do you mean?
Well, there's this fascinating report from the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction that found billions of dollars were lost to waste, fraud, and corruption. Some projects were never completed, others were built so poorly they couldn't be used.
That's just throwing good money after bad, isn't it?
And here's something that really puts it in perspective. The amount spent on the Afghanistan war alone could have funded the entire U.S. education system for more than 3 years.
Wow. When you put it that way, the opportunity cost is just staggering.
And we haven't even touched on the hidden costs yet. Veterans' medical care and disability benefits are expected to cost another $2 trillion over the next 40 years.
So these wars keep costing money long after they're officially over?
Absolutely. And there's another economic aspect we haven't discussed, the impact on global oil markets. Every time there's instability in the Middle East, oil prices spike. During the Iraq War, oil prices tripled.
which affects basically everyone, right? Not just the countries directly involved.
Exactly. It creates this ripple effect through the global economy. And here's something really interesting. Some economists argue that these interventions actually cost more than the entire Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II, even when adjusted for inflation.
That's incredible, and not in a good way. But surely there must have been some economic benefits, defense contracts maybe?
Well, yes and no. While defense contractors certainly profited, studies show that military spending actually creates fewer jobs per dollar than investing in other sectors like healthcare or education.
So we're spending enormous amounts of money on interventions that might actually be making things worse?
That's the trillion-dollar question, literally. And it's leading to some serious soul searching about the true cost benefit analysis of military intervention. When you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue that these massive expenditures have achieved their intended goals.
It really makes you wonder if there might have been better ways to spend all that money.
And that's exactly the debate that's happening now in foreign policy circles. The sheer scale of these costs is forcing a rethink of how and when military intervention should be used as a policy tool. There's a fascinating shift we're seeing in how Western intervention actually happens now. We've moved from boots on the ground to bites in the cloud.
What do you mean exactly? Are we talking about cyber warfare?
That's part of it, but it's even broader. Modern intervention often happens through precision guided weapons, drone strikes, and even social media campaigns. It's completely changed the nature of how outside powers can influence events in the Middle East.
I've heard about drone strikes, but the numbers must be pretty significant by now, right?
The scale is remarkable. In the last decade alone, there have been over 14,000 confirmed drone strikes across the Middle East. And get this, a single drone operator sitting in Nevada can now affect events thousands of miles away in Yemen or Syria.
That's incredible and kind of unsettling. It makes war seem almost like a video game.
And that's exactly what critics worry about. But there's another digital battlefield that's just as important: social media. Remember the Arab Spring?
Of course, that was when social media helped fuel all those protests across the Middle East, right?
Exactly. Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms became crucial organizing tools. But here's where it gets really interesting. Western powers quickly realized they could use these same platforms for their own purposes.
How so?
Well, think about psychological operations. Instead of dropping leaflets from planes like in previous conflicts, now you can target specific demographics with sophisticated social media campaigns.
That sounds a bit like manipulation.
It absolutely is, but it gets even more complex. Remember how ISIS used social media? They ran this incredibly sophisticated digital propaganda campaign, producing high-quality videos, maintaining active social media accounts.
Right, and Western countries had to figure out how to counter that.
Exactly. It became this whole new front in the conflict. The US military actually established special units just to fight this digital battle. They're running counter messaging campaigns, tracking online recruitment efforts.
So we've got physical drone warfare in the sky and digital warfare online, all happening at the same time?
And they're interconnected. Intelligence agencies now use social media to help identify targets for drone strikes. They analyze posts, track location data. It's this whole new dimension of surveillance and intervention.
That's pretty scary when you think about it. How do people in the region feel about all this?
There's growing concern about digital colonialism. Just like how Western powers once drew lines on physical maps, they're now seen as trying to control digital spaces. And here's something fascinating. Local tech companies are starting to push back.
In what way?
They're developing their own social media platforms, their own digital infrastructure. It's like a new kind of digital sovereignty movement. But Western tech companies still largely control the digital landscape.
So the power dynamics haven't really changed? They've just gone high tech?
That's a great way to put it. And it raises some really troubling questions about privacy, sovereignty, and the future of intervention. When you can influence events without ever setting foot in a country, what does that mean for international relations?
And I'm guessing these digital interventions are a lot cheaper than traditional military operations?
Much cheaper, and that's part of what makes them so attractive to Western powers. A sophisticated social media campaign costs a fraction of what a military operation would, but the impact can be just as significant.
It's like we've entered this whole new era of intervention.
And we're still trying to understand all the implications. The rules of engagement in this digital battlefield are still being written. What's clear is that Western intervention hasn't stopped, it's just evolved. Behind all these policies and interventions we've discussed, there's a profound human story that often gets overlooked. We're talking about millions of lives completely upended.
I imagine the numbers must be staggering when you look at the full picture.
They really are. Since 1990 alone, we've seen more than 12 million people forced to flee their homes. That's roughly the entire population of Pennsylvania just displaced.
12 million? What happens to all these people?
Many end up in refugee camps that were meant to be temporary but have become permanent settlements. There's this camp in Jordan, Zatari, that's basically turned into a city. It has its own schools, hospitals, even shopping streets.
So people are literally building new lives in these temporary spaces?
Exactly. And here's something that really puts it in perspective. The average length of time someone remains a refugee is now 20 years. That's an entire generation growing up in limbo.
20 years. That means children are being born and raised as refugees?
Yes, and it's creating this whole new cultural phenomenon. Imagine being born in a refugee camp, growing up there, but being told your real home is somewhere else, somewhere you've never even seen.
That must have such a huge impact on identity and culture.
It really does. And there's another aspect that often gets overlooked the destruction of cultural heritage. When conflict hits places like Palmyra in Syria or the ancient city of Nimrud in Iraq, we're not just losing buildings.
We're losing history itself?
Exactly. These sites have stood for thousands of years, surviving countless conflicts, only to be destroyed in our modern era. But it's not just the ancient sites, even everyday cultural practices are being disrupted.
What do you mean?
Well, think about traditional marriage ceremonies, religious festivals, even basic social customs. When communities are scattered across different countries, maintaining these traditions becomes incredibly difficult.
So the fabric of society itself starts to unravel?
And it happens in ways we might not expect. For instance, in many Middle Eastern cultures, extended family networks are crucial for everything from childcare to business connections. When those networks are shattered by displacement,
The whole support system falls apart.
right? And here's something particularly heartbreaking. We're seeing what experts call cultural orphans. These are young people who are disconnected from both their traditional culture and the culture of their host country.
That must create some serious identity issues.
It does. And it's not just affecting the refugees, the host communities are experiencing massive changes too. Lebanon, for instance, has taken in so many Syrian refugees that about 1 in 4 people in the country is now a refugee.
How does a country even handle that kind of demographic shift?
It puts enormous strain on everything: schools, hospitals, housing, water supplies. And then there's the psychological toll. We're looking at a whole generation growing up with trauma.
The mental health impact must be enormous.
Studies show that more than half of refugee children show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. And here's the thing: traditional support systems that might have helped people cope with trauma have been disrupted too.
So people are dealing with trauma without their usual cultural coping mechanisms?
Exactly. And it creates this cycle that's hard to break. Trauma affects people's ability to adapt to new situations, which in turn creates more stress and difficulty integrating.
It sounds like the ripple effects just keep spreading.
They do. And perhaps most concerning is how these disruptions might affect future generations. When you lose connection to your cultural heritage, when traditional knowledge isn't passed down, those losses can be permanent.
It's like we're watching the erasure of centuries of cultural evolution.
And that's perhaps the most profound cost of all these interventions: the human and cultural toll that can never really be measured in numbers alone. After exploring this century-long cascade of interventions, what really strikes me is how actions that seemed logical at the time created these enormous unintended consequences that we're still grappling with today.
It's pretty sobering when you think about it. From those first lines drawn on a map to modern drone warfare, every intervention seems to create new challenges we didn't anticipate.
And the costs have been staggering in every way. $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan alone, 12 million refugees, entire cultures disrupted. But what's really fascinating is how resilient local communities have proven to be.
I was thinking about that. Despite everything, people find ways to adapt and preserve their traditions, even in refugee camps that have become cities.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important lessons here: the remarkable capacity of human communities to endure and adapt, even in the face of overwhelming outside pressure.
Though it makes you wonder what the Middle East might look like today if some of these interventions had never happened.
That's the thing about history. Every action creates these ripples that keep spreading outward. And as we've seen, those ripples can turn into waves that reshape entire regions for generations.
So what's the takeaway here? What should we learn from all this?
Perhaps it's that before any intervention, we need to think not just about immediate goals, but about the waves we might create and how they might still be crashing on distant shores than 100 years from now.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to share it with your friends. See you next time.